Hey guys, my name is Steven, and today we're going to be talking about playing zones. And this is going to be kind of an intro to playing zones, kind of why we talk about it, and the fundamentals and basics of where to play on each drum. So hopefully you can learn something from this, and hope you enjoy. First of all, let's talk about why we even talk about playing zones in the first place. Unlike other drums, quads don't sound as good when you play in the center of the head. We find that as we get closer to the edge, our sound gets much brighter. If you try it out yourself, you'll find that if you play in the center of the head, you get this very dead, muffled sound. And as you get closer and closer to the rim, you find that the sound starts to open up, and there's much more vibrance to the sound. There's much more just projection. The other reason why we talk about zones is for efficiency's sake. You know, if we just played wherever we want on the drums, you know, it'd be kind of hard to move, and we'd be doing a lot of excess motion, using a lot of muscles we don't really need to be using. So it kind of helps us simplify everything down to where you're going to hit. You know, we can talk about motion with how much you're moving your arms, but it's much easier to talk about motion when you're talking about where you're hitting on the drum, you know, where point A is and where point B is, and you know how to get there. So let's go ahead and talk about where these zones are. On quads, I think the rule of thumb, in my opinion, is 1/3 of the radius. So if the radius is from the center of the head to the rim, we take 1/3 of that distance roughly from the edge, and anywhere around the drum is roughly where the sweet zone is. It's obviously a very subjective topic, so it might be taught differently, or it might be defined differently somewhere else. I don't really think there is a one way to do it. I think there's a lot of ways you can look at it. This is just the way that's worked for me. That being said, the zones on drums 1 and 2 are pretty straightforward. It's just kind of the beads are parallel to each other on drums 1 and 2, and even when you move them across the drums independently, those beads kind of stay in that position. When we move to the Spock, however, it gets kind of gray. For sure, on the 6-inch, you want to play in the center of the head. There's just not a lot of room, and honestly, playing anywhere besides the center does not really make that much of a difference. So the center is usually the sweet spot. On the 8-inch, however, it's kind of debatable. Some people say just play in the center, it doesn't really matter. Some people say play halfway. I like the halfway point on a quint, simply because you don't have to think about doing anything different when you go from spike to Spock, or the 6-inch to the 8-inch. You just go straight across, and that's roughly where I would hit, which is roughly half the radius. So I don't think it's that big of a deal where you hit, but there you go. Drums 3 and 4, however, are a little bit different than the rest of them. Since one hand has to kind of reach across to get to the other side, we kind of have to compensate by adjusting where the zones are. So on drums 3 and 4, drum 4, for example, our left hand is going to be on top, and our right hand is going to be on bottom. The right hand's on bottom simply because it has to get all the way across, and it's kind of impractical to try to get your beat all the way up there. And the left hand's just on top, just because that's the most relaxed position. You know, you could say you could technically play down here. However, the further back you have to pull your elbow, the more tension you're going to have up here. So it's much more relaxing to play up here. It's also easier to maneuver around the drums when your left hand's up there. So again, the same rule applies, 1/3 of the radius, and the same goes for the drum 3 side, where your left hand's on bottom, your right hand's on top, 1/3 from the edge. And then we have the same rule where if we move one hand, the bead still stays in that spot. So that's the general rule of thumb for zones. It's debatable exactly where and how you do it. I think zones are very situational. I don't think this is a universal way of doing it. I think depending on what you're playing and how you're playing it, when you're playing it, and all that, you're going to have to adjust your zones a little bit. You know, crossovers especially, you're going to have to be changing your zones. And we'll talk about that in the next video of zones. All the scrape zones and the crossover zones and all that. This is just a general rule of thumb for kind of where you should place your beads, just moving across the drums or moving back and forth or anything like that. A couple things you want to look out for when you're moving around the drums and you're trying to hit your zones. It is a easy tendency to overshoot when you're going to the outside drums. There's just so much more room out here for error that we're not as disciplined with where we're stopping the bead. So sometimes when you're traveling across, we kind of like shoot out here or kind of in this rough area. So just make sure you're creating a barrier for yourself. I know with these inner drums, there are very clear barriers with like the next drum. Like if you're trying to hit drum 2 from drum 1, you're obviously gonna stop the stick before it gets to drum 4, as opposed to going outwards where there's no real barriers out here. So try to be disciplined, try to create a barrier for yourself and say, I'm not gonna play outside of like this area right here. Another thing you can try to do with zones when you're playing is try to listen for your errors. Don't try to rely on your eyes to figure out if you're playing the right zones. Try to listen for it. Like if you're playing an extended roll or extended passage on one drum, if you start to hear kind of the sound getting muffled and dense, then it probably means you're too far up. So you might want to try pulling it back a little bit, and just when you're moving around, try to identify problems with your ears. That way you don't have to rely on these guys, which are going to be doing a lot of other things like looking for the form or looking up when you're performing and stuff like that. So it's going to be a lot more efficient if you can identify your zone problems with your ears. Anyways, hope that helps. That's just kind of a basic outline of where I think zones are. We'll make a part 2 video which gets a little more specific on where scrape zones are and crossover zones and all the other exceptions that you have to make. But for playing a lot of what you play, you know, just all the simple stuff that aren't fancy, that should be a general rule of thumb. And I think zones are important. I know some people kind of disagree with that. I think zones are important. I don't think you need to be a stickler about it, but I think if your goal is to produce the best sound possible, you have to take into account that where you hit on the drum is going to have a big effect on how you sound overall. Hope this video helps. If you liked what you saw, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.